April 1945. A cold wind swept over the shattered towns of northern Germany. Mud caked the boots of exhausted soldiers, and the air smelled of smoke, wet earth, and fear. In a makeshift processing camp, German women, young auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, communication staff, stood in long, uneven lines. Their uniforms were torn, their faces pale with exhaustion. A guard approached with scissors glinting in the gray light. The women shivered, not from the cold, but from the knowledge of what was coming. Hair, once a source of identity, pride, and discipline, would be clipped short. Some tried to hide behind trembling hands. Others stared blankly at the ground, silent witnesses to the collapse of a world they had once served. Across Europe, the Allies, American, British, French, and Soviet, were converging on Germany, each with their own protocols for processing POWs. What was meant as hygiene often became a public, symbolic act of defeat. In the quiet snip of scissors, a private humiliation became history. This was the beginning of a journey that would leave its mark, not just on the body, but on memory. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. From the West, American, British, and French forces pushed relentlessly across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. From the East, the Soviet Red Army stormed through Pomerania, Silesia, and East Prussia. Cities burned, railways were shattered, and millions of civilians and soldiers alike faced the harsh reality of defeat. The German military, stretched thin and demoralized, relied increasingly on women to fill auxiliary roles, jobs that had once been reserved for men at the front. These women served across multiple branches of the military apparatus. In the Luftwaffe, young women operated communication equipment, handled signals, and maintained vital air traffic records. In the Wehrmacht, clerks processed orders and managed logistical data, often within striking distance of active combat zones. Red Cross nurses and medical auxiliaries worked tirelessly in field hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers under constant bombardment. Each uniform, each rank, carried the weight of a society that prized discipline, obedience, and ideological loyalty. As the Allies advanced, these women were caught in the chaotic tide of surrender. Masses of troops and civilians fled together, often indistinguishable to approaching soldiers. American and British units followed strict protocols: capture, identification, and processing at temporary camps or collection points. Soviet forces, meanwhile, often operated in regions still scarred by brutal combat, and interactions with German prisoners could be harsher, driven by revenge, fear, and the trauma of occupation. Hair, in German culture, held significance beyond vanity. For women, it was a marker of femininity, personal identity, and even moral standing. Within the military, neatly styled hair reinforced discipline and order, symbolizing allegiance to the uniform structure. To forcibly remove or cut, it was to strip away not only pride, but a part of self, a visible and deeply personal sign of defeat. Reports from Allied processing centers detail the convergence of hygiene, security, and humiliation. In the West, American and British units implemented delousing measures: clothing fumigated, hair washed, and in many cases, cut short to prevent lice outbreaks in crowded camps. French and Belgian units, less numerous but still present, followed similar procedures. Yet, across all Western operations, the act of cutting hair quickly acquired an additional psychological weight. For young women, many barely 18, the scissors became a symbol of surrender, a moment when private dignity collided with the cold necessity of military order. The Eastern theater presented a different, often more harrowing picture. Soviet units encountered German women who had served in frontline support or communication roles. The Red Army, having borne the full brunt of Nazi occupation in its western territories, viewed some of these women with suspicion. Haircutting was sometimes paired with public humiliation. Women were forced to stand in lines as soldiers snipped, trimmed, or shaved hair entirely. For survivors, these moments were seared into memory, emblematic of the collapse of not just military structures, but social hierarchies and personal pride. Even within the same army, practices varied. Some officers treated women gently, explaining that hygiene and security demanded short hair. Others, frustrated by months of combat and the intensity of surrender, were indifferent to the women's feelings. Account from POW memoirs recall quiet resistance, whispered pleas, and tears. Some women attempted to cover their heads with scarves, only to be told to remove them. The act itself was mundane, a haircut, but the context transformed it into a ritual of loss, a moment when war intruded on the most intimate personal space. By spring 1945, these processing centers dotted the landscape of defeated Germany. Factories, schools, and warehouses were converted into temporary camps. Soldiers, exhausted and weary, followed standard operating procedures while navigating chaotic crowds of retreating troops and civilians. The women caught in these lines were witnesses to both the logistical machinery of surrender and the moral ambiguities of power. Short hair became a common thread linking disparate experiences, from American-run camps near Bavaria to Soviet-occupied towns in the East, a silent emblem of Germany's defeat and of the personal cost of a war that had consumed every facet of life. The stage was set. Young women, uniformed yet unarmed, confronted with the reality of capture. Scissors hovered, hair fell, and in that act, history marked them, not as combatants, but as symbols of a nation in collapse. The surrender of Germany in 1945 was not a single, neat event. It unfolded across cities, towns, and villages in fragments, with civilians and soldiers mingling in streams of flight and submission. German female auxiliaries, often stationed near the front or in urban administrative hubs, were swept into this tide. Each encounter with Allied forces carried its own rules, rituals, and consequences. In American and British zones, processing followed a structured pattern. Women were separated from men for identification, screened for intelligence purposes, and registered in logbooks. Clothing and personal effects were examined, and delousing was mandatory. Short hair, while framed as a hygiene measure, became a practical necessity. Lice could spread quickly in crowded camps, and haircuts reduced inspection time. Guards often conducted these procedures in daylight, in full view of other prisoners, magnifying the psychological impact. For the women, hair became a currency of control, a visible, tangible marker of surrender. French and Belgian units, present in smaller numbers, followed similar patterns but sometimes added ceremonial elements. Hair was cut to uniform length, measured by inches, and documented. Local newspapers later described these acts in euphemistic terms, sanitation measures, but the women themselves remembered humiliation, whispers, and the heavy silence of compliance. Many accounts note that older female prisoners, trained as nurses or clerks, felt this treatment particularly degrading. For them, hair had been a professional as well as personal symbol, part of the uniform discipline they had upheld under war conditions. In the Soviet-occupied regions, procedures could be harsher. Red Army units, having suffered immense losses and witnessed occupation atrocities, often treated German auxiliaries with suspicion. Haircutting here carried an additional layer of meaning. It was not just hygiene, it was punishment and symbolic retribution. Women who had served near frontline posts in communications, or in administrative roles were sometimes singled out. Reports describe lines of prisoners, shoulders slumped, hands clutching hair, as soldiers moved methodically through the ranks with scissors or razors. In some cases, the hair was removed entirely. In others, it was trimmed to a uniform shortness. Survivors recall that this was often done publicly, in front of male prisoners and local civilians, amplifying the humiliation. Historical documents show that these measures were sometimes codified, sometimes ad hoc. U.S. military manuals in 1945 emphasized health and security, but acknowledged the morale implications of forced haircuts. The Geneva Convention of 1929, governing the treatment of prisoners of war, mandated humane treatment but did not explicitly address hair, leaving the procedure in a gray zone where practicality and psychology intersected. Soviet records were less formalized, but camp regulations frequently cited sanitation and order as justification, though the methods could be inconsistent and, at times, punitive. The societal meaning of hair in Germany intensified these experiences. Within German culture, long or carefully styled hair represented femininity, respectability, and, for those in uniform, professional decorum. Forced cutting was not simply a logistical measure. It was a visible symbol of defeat. In some towns, local populations whispered about the women's shame, associating short hair with collaboration or moral compromise. Propaganda had long reinforced the idealized image of the disciplined, loyal German woman. To cut her hair was to strip away that identity and expose vulnerability. First-hand accounts illustrate the diversity of responses. Some women obeyed quietly, focusing on the pragmatic need to survive. Others resisted, hiding strands under scarves or refusing to part their hair. Letters later sent home describe both the fear of Allied authority and the bitter embarrassment of public processing. Camp officials noted that even when haircuts were routine, the emotional toll was profound. For many, the act lingered as a symbol of defeat long after repatriation. By examining these variations across Allied forces, a complex picture emerges. Haircutting was never solely a tool of punishment, nor purely hygiene. It existed in a liminal space, balancing practical necessity, moral ambiguity, and psychological weight. In Western zones, it was a standardized part of processing. In Eastern zones, it could carry punitive overtones. Across the continent, for the women involved, the moment of surrender was punctuated by the fall of strands of hair, a quiet testament to the collapse of military order and social hierarchy. The stage was now set for deeper exploration. Beyond the procedural aspects, we begin to see the human, tactical, symbolic, and moral dimensions of this event, how it shaped experiences, influenced perceptions, and left lasting impressions on both captives and captors. For the young women standing in line, scissors hovering above their heads were more than a tool. They were a silent arbiter of fear and identity. Many were barely 18, drafted into auxiliary roles with the belief that they were serving their country in a disciplined professional capacity. Their uniforms had offered protection, structure, and a sense of belonging. Now, stripped of long hair, they were confronted with vulnerability and exposure. Memoirs from survivors describe the sensation vividly. The cold shock of the first snip, the way hair fell in clumps to the mud-stained ground, the reflective pause as they stared at faces they barely recognized. Some wept quietly, shielding their eyes. Others stood rigid, forcing themselves to comply. The act was intimate yet public, private yet witnessed by strangers. In these moments, the collapse of Germany was measured not only in cities taken or lines breached, but in the loss of personal dignity, of the markers that had defined them as individuals within a rigid military and cultural system. Even beyond the immediate act, the psychological effects lingered. Short hair, often associated with shame or punishment, became a visible emblem of defeat. Women carried this mark into POW camps, through long waits for repatriation, and into post-war life. Hair regrowth could not immediately erase the memory. For many, it remained a symbol of humiliation endured, a silent testament to resilience in the face of overwhelming power. From the perspective of Allied forces, the haircutting of female POWs was as much a matter of practicality as psychology. In the chaos of mass surrender, hygiene was paramount. Camps were crowded, clothing was soiled, lice infestations were common, and medical officers feared outbreaks. Hair, long and unkempt after months of retreat, became a potential vector for disease. Military manuals of the time emphasized rapid processing. Short hair simplified identification, reduced the spread of vermin, and allowed for quick inspections of scalps for wounds or concealed contraband. In the United States and Britain, designated processing stations moved efficiently. Women were stripped of outer garments, examined, deloused, and had their hair clipped to a standard length. Guards monitored compliance, balancing speed with minimal resistance. Even in the East, where Soviet procedures were less formalized, practical concerns existed. Short hair eased the management of large numbers of prisoners and allowed camp personnel to detect lice or wounds more easily. While punitive or symbolic aspects were layered over the process, the underlying tactical rationale remained: maintain order, prevent disease, and mitigate risk in a chaotic, overcrowded environment. In this sense, scissors were both hygiene and control, a measure born of necessity in a maelstrom of collapsing Germany. In German society, hair carried a weight far beyond mere appearance. For women in uniform, it was a marker of discipline, professionalism, and cultural identity. Long, neatly maintained hair reflected personal pride and adherence to societal norms. Military propaganda reinforced this ideal, portraying female auxiliaries as loyal, orderly, and morally upright. Forced haircutting shattered this image. Each snip of the scissors became a symbolic act of erasure. A woman's hair, once a private expression of self, was transformed into a public emblem of defeat. Observers, both soldiers and local civilians, interpreted short hair as a sign of surrender, humiliation, or collaboration with the enemy. Even when justified by hygiene, the psychological impact was undeniable. The women's identities were literally and visibly cut away, leaving them exposed to scrutiny, judgment, and internalized shame. This symbolism extended beyond individual experience. Hair became a lens through which the collapse of the Third Reich was interpreted. The act of cutting it short condensed the vast machinery of military defeat into a simple, human gesture, one that could be seen, felt, and remembered. From the perspective of Allied soldiers, the women in front of them were a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and bureaucratic obligation. American and British troops were trained to view auxiliaries as non-combatants, yet uncertainty lingered. Could they be hiding weapons, intelligence, or loyal Nazi operatives? Haircuts simplified identification, removed potential concealment, and standardized appearance. Soviet troops, shaped by years of occupation and brutal combat, often approached female POWs with greater suspicion. In some instances, young women who had worked in communications or administrative roles were considered collaborators or complicit in military operations. The act of cutting hair served both as a precaution and, in the minds of some soldiers, as a punitive measure. Witness accounts from German women describe soldiers who were indifferent, others who treated them with kindness, and some whose actions carried undertones of revenge or moral judgment. In all cases, hair became a focal point of perception. Shortened hair symbolized control for captors, a visual confirmation of authority over those who had previously belonged to the enemy. It allowed soldiers to manage chaos, enforce order, and navigate moral ambiguities in an environment where traditional rules of engagement were strained by exhaustion, anger, and trauma. The haircutting of female POWs occupies a complex moral space. On one hand, hygiene, identification, and camp management were legitimate concerns. On the other, forcing women to undergo a procedure with public and psychological consequences bordered on humiliation. International law, codified in the Geneva Convention of 1929, required humane treatment of prisoners, yet it left room for interpretation. Haircuts were not explicitly addressed, creating a gray zone where necessity and cruelty intersected. For the women, the moral tension was profound. Complying meant survival, but came at the cost of personal dignity. Resisting risked punishment or prolonging captivity. For Allied soldiers, the moral calculus was equally complex. They acted within military regulations, yet every snip carried human consequences. Some officers reflected later on the psychological weight of their actions, acknowledging that even necessary procedures could inflict trauma. This moral ambiguity underscores a broader truth of total war. Victory often came at the expense of human dignity. Haircutting, simple in execution, yet potent in effect, became a silent testament to the ethical gray zones that defined the final months of the conflict. In one camp near Lübeck, a group of women who had served as Luftwaffe communications personnel awaited their turn. They exchanged quiet glances, measuring courage in each other's faces. The first chair was emptying, scissors moving steadily, and the sound of hair falling to the wooden floor filled the air. For some, Iwame 1945. The towns of Bavaria and northern Germany lay in ruins. Smoke drifted over flattened rooftops, and the smell of wet earth and charred wood lingered in the air. Amid this desolation, columns of exhausted German women were escorted into temporary processing camps. They were auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, and communications personnel, trained, disciplined, yet unarmed and entirely at the mercy of their captors. In one camp near Munich, the line stretched for hundreds of meters. American soldiers moved methodically, clipboard in hand. A sign above the entrance read simply, POW processing. Women shuffled forward, their uniforms muddied, their hands trembling. At the center of the camp, a small platform was set up. On it, a chair, a basin, and a pair of steel scissors awaited. Officers had instructed soldiers to enforce hygiene and expedite identification, but the act took on a symbolic weight far beyond its procedural purpose. As the first woman was seated, the guard spoke quietly, almost apologetically, yet with authority. Hair fell in strips, matting into the floor. Others watched, silent and tense. Some tried to shield their faces. Others stared straight ahead, forcing themselves to comply. One young clerk, barely 17, whispered a prayer under her breath as strands of her chestnut hair tumbled to the ground. Around her, the air was heavy with fear, shame, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the world they had known was over. In northern Germany, British forces conducted similar procedures. Women who had been stationed in Lübeck and Hamburg were lined against barracks walls, bathed in the gray light of early morning. Soldiers moved efficiently, but their movements were deliberate and visible, ensuring that compliance was public. Short hair became both practical and punitive. Lies could be spotted more easily, and uniformity allowed guards to maintain control. Yet for the women, the snip of scissors sounded like a drumbeat of defeat. Soviet-occupied regions presented a harsher reality. In Mecklenburg, reports describe women captured after weeks of chaotic retreats. Their uniforms were torn, boots mud-stained, and faces etched with exhaustion. Red Army soldiers, some bearing the scars of months of combat, supervised the haircutting. Some women were shamed publicly, their hair removed entirely, leaving them exposed to both scrutiny and whispered ridicule from locals and fellow prisoners. In these moments, the act of cutting hair was inseparable from the psychological intensity of surrender. The tension was palpable. In every camp, a mixture of fear, resignation, and quiet defiance filled the air. Some women attempted to cover their heads with scarves or hands, only to be told to remove them. Some refused to look up, keeping their gaze fixed on the ground. Soldiers carried out orders with efficiency, yet the human element could not be erased. For every snip, there was a flinch, a sigh, a tear, small acts of resistance against the tide of history sweeping over them. Reports from Red Cross observers and camp records reveal another layer. The women's peers often witnessed the haircutting of friends or colleagues, amplifying the emotional impact. Those waiting in line experienced anticipatory anxiety, fearing the loss of their own identity. Their sense of self reinforced by hair, carefully maintained through years of discipline and wartime service. Every haircut was a ripple in a larger wave of defeat, marking both individual and collective surrender. In Bavaria, the process unfolded in daylight, under the gaze of guards and camp personnel. The hair, once a private and personal symbol, became public property, discarded without ceremony. Some women whispered quietly to each other, drawing comfort from solidarity. Others remained silent, internalizing the humiliation. Even as the procedure ended for one group, another moved forward, perpetuating the cycle of fear and compliance. Across the continent, from Munich to Lübeck to Mecklenburg, a common thread emerged. Haircuts, while ostensibly practical, became the focal point of surrender, humiliation, and control. The moment a pair of scissors touched strands of chestnut, blonde, or black hair, the abstract collapse of a nation was made tangible. This was more than a procedure. It was a turning point in the lives of these women, a visual and visceral acknowledgement that the Third Reich had fallen, and they were powerless to stop it. For the first time, the women fully confronted the reality of their captivity. Uniforms were intact, papers checked, and orders given, but their control over themselves, over their appearance, over the markers of personal identity, had been stripped away. In this quiet, painful ritual, the war's human cost became immediate and intimate. The act of cutting hair, simple yet profound, crystallized the collapse of authority, pride, and dignity. The stage was now set for the next moments. As hair fell, so did the psychological barrier between prisoners and captors, setting in motion the complex aftermath of humiliation, resilience, and reflection that would define the post-war memory of these women. The snip of scissors echoed through the tents and courtyards, a metronome of surrender. In Soviet-occupied Mecklenburg, a group of young German auxiliaries had been rounded up after fleeing the front lines. They had marched for days through bombed-out villages, carrying only the essentials. Their uniforms were torn, boots soaked, and hair matted from weeks of wear. Now, standing before soldiers whose faces bore the scars of war, they faced a ritual that was at once mundane and deeply personal. Some of the women tried to resist. One nurse, whose blonde hair had been a point of pride, clasped her hands over her head. A soldier's firm hand guided her into the chair, and the first locks fell. Others froze, staring at the ground, suppressing tears. A clerk whispered to her neighbor, a quiet reminder that they were not alone, even as strangers observed every movement. In that moment, fear and solidarity intertwined. American and British camps presented a slightly different atmosphere, though no less intense. Processing lines moved efficiently, but the psychological tension remained. Officers instructed soldiers to cut hair short for hygiene and uniformity, yet the women sensed the symbolic weight behind each snip. Memoirs record that some guards tried to offer small comforts, a gentle word, a quick apology, but the ritual itself could not be softened. The hair, once a private assertion of identity, became public property, discarded without ceremony. That's the first time they realized the full scale of their defeat. Not just military, but personal. Hair, carefully maintained for years, had been forcibly removed. It was a tangible measure of lost autonomy. Soviet records describe a more chaotic scene in Pomerania. Here, women were sometimes forced to kneel on cold ground, hair clipped in front of local civilians. The public nature of the act amplified humiliation. Soldiers occasionally jeered or shouted instructions, further emphasizing the power imbalance. Yet not all encounters were cruel. Some officers instructed their troops to act quickly and silently, focusing on efficiency rather than spectacle. The variance underscores the complexity of these events. Identical procedures could be either clinical or punitive, depending on individual choices and local conditions. The aftermath of each haircut was immediate and visceral. Women touched their scalps, feeling exposed and raw. Some clutched the remaining strands in disbelief, reluctant to accept the new reality. Others looked at each other, recognizing shared vulnerability. Even when the process ended, its psychological echo persisted. In letters later sent home, women described sleepless nights, a sense of shame that lingered long after their release, and the small, quiet ways they tried to reclaim dignity through hats, scarves, or the slow regrowth of hair. For Allied soldiers, the act of cutting hair was both routine and revealing. Many were weary from months of combat, tasked with maintaining order in flooded towns and improvised camps. Haircuts offered a visible measure of control. In American and British camps, officers often noted in reports that the procedure reduced lice infestations, standardized appearance, and eased identification. In Soviet camps, similar practical concerns were coupled with a heavier moral undertone, shaped by revenge, trauma, and suspicion of auxiliary personnel. Across all theaters, a shared pattern emerged. The haircut was not a single, isolated act. It was a turning point in the prisoner's experience, crystallizing the transition from combatant or auxiliary to captive. The moment a lock of hair fell, the abstract reality of Germany's defeat became immediate, tangible, and intensely personal. Soldiers witnessed, recorded, and enforced this ritual. Women endured it silently, resisted quietly, and internalized its weight. By the end of May 1945, thousands of German female POWs had passed through similar processing stations across Europe. Hair had been clipped, heads bowed, and personal dignity tested. Yet within this enforced ritual, traces of resilience endured. Shared glances, whispered reassurances, and the small, unrecorded acts of defiance created a human counterpoint to the machinery of surrender. This was the culmination of the POW experience, the convergence of military necessity, symbolic humiliation, and psychological intensity. Haircuts, while simple in execution, became a defining feature of captivity, linking hygiene, security, and human emotion. In the quiet aftermath, women would carry the memory of these moments long after uniforms were folded and camps emptied. With the snip of the last scissors, the initial shock of surrender faded into the grinding reality of captivity. German female POWs, their hair now cropped short, entered a new phase, the long, uncertain days within Allied processing camps. The physical act of haircutting was over, but the consequences, practical, psychological, and social, were only beginning to unfold. In American and British camps across Bavaria and northern Germany, women were housed in converted schools, warehouses, and makeshift barracks. Tents and wooden bunks were crowded. Privacy was minimal. The short hair, intended to prevent lice, made it harder to stay warm in early spring, leaving young women shivering in damp, cold conditions. Uniforms were standardized, bedding sparse, and food rations often inadequate. While hygiene and security were the official rationale, the act of forced haircutting left a lingering sense of exposure. Strangers now saw them stripped of a symbol of identity, their vulnerability intensified by the constant presence of guards and fellow prisoners. Red Cross reports from camps in the British and American zones detail the emotional weight carried by the women. Letters smuggled or sent home described quiet humiliation, the difficulty of looking in mirrors, the sense of being marked by the experience, and the small, secret acts used to reclaim dignity. A scarf tied carefully, hair brushed when possible, or a polite exchange with a sympathetic guard. Hair, once a private statement, had become a public record of defeat. Even after hygiene procedures were complete, its absence was felt, a daily reminder of powerlessness. In Soviet-occupied camps, conditions were harsher. Women often endured prolonged waiting periods, exposure to cold, and more regimented routines. Haircutting here carried additional social and moral implications. Public shaming sometimes accompanied the procedure, emphasizing a prisoner's vulnerability in front of peers and local civilians. Accounts describe the whispered consolations exchanged among women, small bonds of solidarity forming amidst humiliation. These networks of support became essential for psychological survival, offering reassurance and a sense of agency in otherwise powerless circumstances. The effect of short hair extended beyond warmth and appearance. For many, it symbolized the transition from auxiliary personnel to fully recognized prisoner of war. Identification became easier for guards, inspections more thorough, control over individuals more complete. The women's reduced autonomy was amplified by this visible marker, creating a constant reminder that they were now subjects of Allied authority. Even simple acts, combing, tying, or covering hair, became tactical gestures of resistance or comfort. Daily life in the camps was a mix of routine and uncertainty. Tasks included cooking, cleaning, and maintaining personal hygiene under strict supervision. Education or occupation programs were rare, but reading, letter writing, and conversation became lifelines for morale. For many, the physical absence of hair mirrored an internal stripping of self, a shared reminder of the collapse of their world. Yet human resilience persisted. Women found subtle ways to preserve dignity, arranging clothing, performing minor chores with precision, and forming small communities to offer mutual support. Letters sent home describe how even small gestures mattered. A guard offering a gentle word, a fellow prisoner sharing a bit of bread, or the quiet act of brushing short hair. Each morning became acts of reclaiming agency. In some camps, women began to see short hair not only as humiliation, but also as a uniform of survival, a visual statement that they had endured the surrender and remained alive. The physical and psychological impact of haircutting would remain long after the immediate processing was complete. Shyness, embarrassment, and a sense of altered identity persisted in camps across Europe, affecting interpersonal dynamics and morale. Yet within these constraints, the women displayed resilience, adaptability, and quiet defiance. They learned to navigate the spaces imposed upon them, using small acts of control to mitigate the powerlessness imposed by captivity. By the end of spring 1945, the first waves of German female POWs had settled into the routines of camp life. Hair short, uniforms neat, Identities reframed, they faced weeks, sometimes years, of confinement, reflection, and adaptation. The act of haircutting, once a brief and intimate moment of humiliation, had rippled outward into every aspect of their daily existence. It was not simply a cosmetic procedure. It was a turning point that shaped experiences, morale, and social dynamics within the microcosm of captivity. As weeks turned into months, the initial shock of captivity and haircutting transformed into the slow rhythm of camp life. For German female POWs, short hair became a marker of survival and endurance, yet also remained a constant reminder of humiliation. In American, British, and French camps, women learned to navigate this new reality, balancing obedience with small acts of personal dignity. Scarves, headbands, and careful grooming became subtle means of reclaiming self-expression within the rigid confines of captivity. Repatriation began in phases, often delayed by administrative bottlenecks, transport limitations, and the chaos of post-war Europe. In some zones, women remained in camps for months, their hair gradually regrowing as they waited for passage home. Letters from the period reveal a mixture of relief, lingering shame, and a desire to rebuild identity. Hair, once a tool of humiliation, slowly became a symbol of reclamation, an outward sign of endurance in the face of collective defeat. The social consequences were complex. In post-war Germany, short hair carried connotations of shame in certain communities. Women who had served as auxiliaries, clerks, or communications personnel sometimes faced whispers of collaboration or moral compromise. Even when their roles had been entirely professional and non-combatant, the visible mark of captivity, cropped hair, could provoke judgment or social discomfort. Some women reported feeling alienated among peers who had remained behind, their appearance a subtle, persistent reminder of what had been endured. Yet memory and reflection also offered opportunities for empowerment. Interviews decades later with former POWs reveal that the shared experience of haircutting created bonds of solidarity that endured long after the war. Women remembered not only humiliation, but also the courage and resilience of their peers. Small gestures, comforting whispers, shared scarves, or quiet mutual reassurance had formed a lifeline during captivity. These connections, forged under duress, often became the most vivid and enduring memories of their post-war lives. Allied authorities also reflected on the moral and practical dimensions of these procedures. Military manuals and post-war reports highlighted the necessity of hygiene and efficient processing, but acknowledged the psychological consequences. Some officers admitted discomfort, recognizing that an act designed for safety and order could also humiliate. In Soviet zones, where punishment and revenge sometimes intersected with routine processing, the long-term effects on both prisoner morale and civilian perception became more pronounced. The ethical ambiguity of these acts lingered, shaping future discussions of POW treatment and international law. By the time repatriation was complete, many women returned home physically whole but psychologically marked. Hair regrowth offered a tangible sense of recovery, yet the memory of public exposure, fear, and vulnerability persisted. For some, the experience became a lens through which they interpreted authority, gender, and societal expectations. The act of haircutting, brief in duration but profound in consequence, remained a symbolic touchstone for the broader human cost of war. The ways in which ordinary people, removed from combat roles, could be subjected to power, control, and humiliation. In the decades that followed, German society selectively remembered and sometimes forgot these events. The broader narrative of defeat and reconstruction often overshadowed individual experiences of humiliation. Yet within personal memoirs, oral histories, and post-war reflections, The story of haircuts persisted, a quiet testament to endurance, shared trauma, and the resilience of identity. For these women, short hair was more than a practical measure. It was a marker of survival, a memory of fear, and ultimately, a step toward reclaiming dignity in the uncertain aftermath of total war. War does not only claim lives, it reshapes identity, strips away dignity, and leaves marks both visible and unseen. For German female POWs in 1945, the simple act of cutting hair captured this truth with piercing clarity. Strands fell to the ground, carrying with them pride, discipline, and a sense of belonging. What might have been a routine hygiene procedure became a symbol of defeat, a tangible reminder that personal autonomy could be overridden by the sweeping forces of history. Yet within this act of humiliation, resilience quietly endured. Women shared glances, whispered reassurances, and small gestures of defiance that reaffirmed their humanity. In camp lines, tents, and processing stations across Europe, hair was cut, but dignity was not entirely lost. Each day in captivity became an exercise in adaptation, a negotiation between obedience and self-preservation, shame and survival. Hair regrew, but memory remained, forging a link between past suffering and the capacity to endure. The story of these women illuminates broader truths about total war. It reminds us that even non-combatants, far from the front lines, can experience the crushing weight of authority, the subtle cruelty of symbolic gestures, and the moral ambiguity that accompanies military necessity. Haircutting, a brief and intimate act, became a lens through which the collapse of the Third Reich, the anxieties of soldiers, and the fragile resilience of prisoners can be observed. Ultimately, this episode speaks to the quiet strength of those caught in circumstances beyond their control. It is a reminder that history is not only written in battles won or lost, but in small, human experiences, moments of fear, endurance, and recovery. The snip of scissors, once a mark of defeat, became part of a journey toward reclamation, a testament to resilience, and a reflection on the enduring human cost of war. In remembering the German female POWs and the humiliation they endured, we honor not only the fragility of identity in wartime, but the profound courage required simply to survive, endure, and reclaim dignity in the aftermath of total collapse.